This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. This episode is being brought to you in our brand new studio / Ron's new office.
The new After Class Studios.
Yes, 5 feet away, next door to your previous office and studio.
We're probably about 20, 25 feet with a wall between us from where we were recording before. But and I'm still in the process of moving. I haven't moved my books in. One of the walls needs some repair. So a little bit of work before it's fully ready. But next Monday, I'll come in and move all my books over here and get all these bookshelves filled. So I'll completely evacuate my old office and clean it up for the new occupant next week.
Yeah, so if it sounds different, that's why. If it sounds the same, that's why.
I think there's a lot more space here. I mean, I personally feel a lot less compressed.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to move over here. Yeah. It's funny because I have like almost 30% more bookcases. I have 2 windows now. It's all really nice. But it's just a bigger office. And like to walk into this office, because it's a corner office, it feels like there's a little hallway. Like if somebody were to poke, his or her head through the door, they still would have to walk about 5 or 6 feet to get into the office. So I feel a bit more secluded, and I like that.
It's like a little hobbit house,
A little bit. It kind of feels that way. So solitude is one of my favorite things, and this offers me a little bit more solitude. Yeah. But it's a nice office. I'm happy to be over here.
It's coming along nicely.
Yeah. So hopefully for the listener, it provides a better experience listening to the After Class
change.
Yeah,
it'll be the exact same.
He will notice nothing. Well, we are starting a new mini series. I think we're forecasting it will be 2 episodes long.
We'll see.
That has been one suggestion. Early numbers are in.
Yeah. I mean, it should be mini compared to the other ones we've done.
Yeah.
But we'd like to get we'd like to do 2 episodes here. It could be 3 or 4. You never know how things are going to go with us. So.
Yeah, and the subject has to do with the bad press that Christianity sometimes receives.
Yeah.
Right. That some public Christian figure or institution has done something that society is just clamping down on. They're getting all sorts of bad press in the news. Social media is going nuts, throwing them under the bus, and Christians are posturing themselves in relation to it because they feel connected a little bit because they're Christians who are getting bad press, and they feel disconnected because it's not my Christians that are doing that stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so people, have different responses. And the question we want to ask is, what is there any biblical guidance on how we might respond when other Christians are getting bad press because of something they've done?
Yeah.
It's tough. We live in a world where we're trying to talk with people on a personal basis, but in their minds, all they can think of is that story, whatever that story is, and they can't get past that. And so then they superimpose all that on all Christians, including us, like in our relationship. And so it's hard to get past that for evangelistic purposes or just talking about the goodness and the faith that we have. We have to deal with all this crap first, and it's obnoxious.
Yeah, and I think that for us, the last thing we want is to be lumped in with bad people. No matter who you are, it's not just a Christian thing, it's just a people thing. That if there's somebody who is somehow connected to the group we identify with, and that person is exposed as a bad person, we don't want to be associated with that. And so it's like, that's not me, that's not what I'm doing. There's immediately this just defensive posture that I think that rises up inside of us to protect ourselves and our own reputations in light of these new revelations. And so it's very easy, it's a very human thing to do that with regard to being a Christian.
Yeah, and we, not only do we have our own vested reasons to want, to say something, to distance ourselves from that so people wouldn't think that that's us. Mm-hmm. But there is also often a societal pressure.
Yeah.
It's time for everyone to weigh in now.
Yeah.
And, condemn these people.
Right. Exactly.
And so they're looking to us as part of the everyone. Will you weigh in?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they want us to join in. It's this very interesting sociological, anthropological kind of a study where to be a part of a group, you've got to join in with them. You've got to show that you're a member in good standing. And so if everybody is just dumping on this one person or this one institution, hey, come on and join us, dump in with us so that we know that you're a part of our group.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of pressure to do that. I think most people are very unconscious of it. It's not something they think through, but they feel that pressure to say, oh yeah, they're such a horrible person or whatever, and just start bagging on them really bad. And for us as Christians, the question is, does the gospel provide us with a different response? Does Jesus say, here is how you're supposed to respond in these situations? That it just seems like it's always the case. It's going to be different than the world. That really should set us apart and make us look different. But we don't always do that instinctively. That's why the gospel is so transformative, is it says, I know your instinct is to do this, but are you going to transform that into something that looks more like a God-like response?
Yeah. It is parallels, the world's invitation, not just to look to us to weigh in whenever Christians have done something stupid, but they will ask us to join them in weighing in on when anyone has done something stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It's just kind of, and so for us, the question is our response to that any different than our response when they're a Christian or when they're not a Christian?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And why this becomes, a matter of discernment and not just a no-brainer is the Bible talks a lot, the New Testament talks a lot about, if there's a fellow believer in your life, in your church, who is committing some kind of egregious sin or even small sin, right?
Yeah.
Like we are asked to intervene, to say something, to do something, the famous Matthew 18, go to that person one-on-one. If they don't respond, bring someone else. If they don't respond, bring it before the body, right?
Yep.
Like there's a clear invitation to act and to do something when a fellow believer around us is straying from the path.
Yep.
Do we have reason to believe that approach also applies when a Christian, way on the West Coast or the East Coast is doing something, someone we've never met, but we might feel like we know because of social media and the news, or we've read their books or whatever, that we might feel connected to them. Are we called to relate in the same way as if they were a brother or sister, right, in our church family? So
well, I think that's one of the dangers of celebrity, is it creates a false sense of connection, because with celebrities, politicians, actors, musicians, or whoever, because they're in the media, we begin to learn about their lives. And they talk, they do interviews, and we don't know them. We don't really know their lives. But because we see their faces, we feel like we do know them. And so that's one of the dangers of celebrities. It creates that false sense of connection that, as I said earlier, people don't really examine. They just think, I know you. It's like when you're a celebrity and people walk up to you on the street, hey, love your TV show, love your music, or whatever. And they're like, thanks, I don't know who you are. But the person approaching them feels differently. It's like, I know you because I see you all the time. And it's that disconnect that most people are not really aware of. And that's important because we don't necessarily know the details of their lives. We just know what's being fed to us through the media, or what that person's willing to share, which is usually them at their best. And then we get the negative stuff and we're like, oh, look how horrible that person is. But we don't know as much as we think that we know. And certainly the media isn't the most honest source of information. Doesn't matter what you're talking about.
Yeah, I've had to get a bodyguard because of all the people who recognize me. It's been tough to go out of the house, to be honest.
Yeah. Sam, can I get your autograph?
Yeah,
Can we take a picture with you?
So
Can I
much
get a selfie
so much
with
of
you?
that. Yeah.
yeah, and to some extent we've experienced a little bit of this through the podcast. Like people listen to us a lot and they feel like they know us.
Yep.
They feel like they've met us, and to some extent they have. We do a lot of talking and we talk about our personal lives, et cetera.
Yeah.
But certainly the relationship is not two directional, right?
Yeah.
But even the glimpse they get is not altogether accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember we had an SCJ conference, and a friend of someone who was going to the conference with us, I think down in Tennessee or somewhere, that neither of us have met, was joining us on that trip.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? And
Yep,
then,
that was Jim. Yep.
They met, and I remember meeting this person, introducing them, and they're like, wow, you're a lot taller than I thought. And I'm like,
No one says that about John. Just kidding.
well, no, because I'm not tall. I'm exactly average, right? But they're used to seeing like our Facebook account, like it has pictures of us,
Yeah.
and if it's just me standing next to two of you, you guys are both really tall.
That's
like
fair.
there's average sized people, small people, short people,
Yep.
average size, there's like medium sized, tall, and there's like really tall, and you guys are like in the really tall camp.
We're at the bottom of the really tall camp, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
And so, but the media portrayal on our Facebook page would have me compared to you guys. It would seem like I'm in the
Yeah.
really short camp. And actually, I'm kind of average, right? But that's just a little example, like how media lies.
It
right?
does.
It just paints
Yeah.
a picture that's not accurate, and I've had to deal with this at some level in people writing book reviews of books I published, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
who don't know me at all, but who think they know me,
Right. Yeah.
right? Or they've read one Facebook post or a blog post that I read. I remember I wrote a blog post a while ago, just challenging. It's like elections and idolatry. It was the most viral blog I've ever done because somehow it got picked up by all these organizations. It was right around election season, so everyone was hot on it.
I remember that one.
But there was someone who literally created a web page that didn't exist before with a web domain name and everything to take down my blog, like to do a theoretical, logical takedown.
Yeah, hit piece on it.
And it's a giant. I mean, he must have done 20 different blogs that were as long as my first blog, my first and only blog, to take down my blog, and just made all sorts of assumptions of who I am and what I believe.
Yeah.
Right, and they were just so inaccurate, just so grossly inaccurate to think by reading one thing I've written that you know me.
Exactly.
And so anyway, we're kind of building the complexity of the topic, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
What is our response to Christians that we don't really know, who have been caught red-handed with their hand in the cookie jar, whatever, doing something that is pretty bad, right? Enough to, kind of gear up the whole cancel train. And what is our response to that? And should it be different for us to fellow believers or unbelievers, or should it be the same? So that's the topic we want to take on. So I thought we'd begin by listing just a few examples of people whose name in the media has been taken down. So can you guys think of any? It's just
yeah, he handed me this. I started writing, immediately started jotting down some. The one that's in the news lately because of reality show stuff are the Duggars, right? And some of the Duggar children have done terrible sexual things and other awful things, and so.
You want to describe who the Duggars are, like for those who
not really, but
big
they're
picture.
this family that doesn't believe in birth control, so they have 20 or some kids.
So there's 19 kids. My wife has watched that show a lot. So it's like the 19 kids and counting. I think they topped out at 19. They couldn't get that round number.
Yeah.
But they've just had. I know, right?
That would torture me forever. I'd adopt.
Got to get that 20th kid in there. Got to feel good about this. But they had a show on TLC for a really long time, examining their family, and they lived in a giant house. The dad built this huge house. They have grown kids and they have like toddler age kids, because they're just spreading it out. And it was kind of a fascinating show because it's so out of the norm. Watching this really huge family, trying to get a sense of how they interact. And as some of the older kids were growing up and getting married, you had these side stories following them in their life. So some of the daughters and their husbands were going off and doing other things. So you'd have these, different segments focusing on their lives. And so it's a reality show. These are just real people kind of living their lives. Apparently from a Christian family, that would be one of the main things. And so it was on for quite a few years. Yeah. But one of the kids, the oldest son, was convicted of pedophilia, if I remember right.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah, and having child pornography, and I guess even sexually molesting some of his sisters.
Right.
So he was the one kid that had that issue. It wasn't a whole bunch of them. I'm pretty sure it was.
To be fair, yes.
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm representing them accurately. But in this new series that's come out, this kind of behind the scenes one, some of the kids are talking about what life was like, and it's not necessarily a positive one. They're kind of giving a different perspective. And the TLC show is all just for the most part very positive. And now they're saying, well, here's some of the negatives.
The shadow side.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of a summary. And I only know it because, like I said, my wife was a huge fan, and now she's watching the documentary, the behind-the-scenes thing, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, here's some other stuff that we didn't really know about." So she's been filling me in on that.
Yeah. I can keep going. Recently, the Hillsong scandal, where the senior minister guy has been caught having an affair with his secretary, and he also covered up some things, I believe, for his father-in-law, things he was going through. So that's never a good thing.
Yeah.
You've got the whole Liberty University thing with Falwell Jr. and his sexual deviance, and he just doesn't seem to be a very good guy, but here he is, the president of the largest Christian university in the country.
Yeah.
You got the Mars Hill with Mark Driscoll, and so there was the whole rise and fall of Mars Hill, and it came out like the things that he was doing and controlling and all the rest. Obviously, you've got the Catholic Church with the priests and the abuse, and that's been ongoing for quite a while now. I can keep going.
Right.
That's enough or not. I think it'd be just even other things with not celebrities, where just Christians, where they'll like blow up an abortion clinic, or they'll enact violence against abortion type situations, Planned Parenthood, and all the rest, where it just it comes across as being pretty awful.
Yeah.
They might back a presidential candidate.
Sure.
Yeah, that was another Liberty University thing, and the strong support that Falwell Jr. had for Trump. And then you get that on the other side too. It's not just right, it's both a right and left, red blue kind of a thing. But all the political involvements can also become a hot point, because that just puts you in the crosshairs of the people on the other side of the aisle. Yeah. And it's not just about attacking you or your beliefs, but now you become an object for a takedown, because it's like, by taking you down, I can hopefully support my candidate of choice and all that.
Yeah. So sadly, there are plenty of scandals we could choose from, enumerate that are out there.
Yeah. Well, if you're old enough, in the 80s, early 90s, that's when a lot of the televangelists were being taken down.
Right. Sure.
And I remember those because they were really popular in the 70s or early 80s. But then the scandals began to erupt, financial scandals with PTL, and then sexual scandals and all that. Money and sex, those things are going to get you in trouble. If you do not handle those in a godly way, you can just be assured that eventually it's going to catch up with you. And that's the thing, like you were saying, Sam, how people will try to cover things up and everything. And does it ever work? It's
Nope.
like maybe you can cover it up for a little while,
Right.
but eventually that's going to get out there. It's like, why would you try to do a cover-up? Do you not know the history of these things? Yeah. And you're just adding fuel to the fire, because now it's not just even exposing the bad thing, but now it's complicated and made worse by the cover-up.
Yeah. And you have, things that are less overtly scandalous and sinful. Like, society is willing to recognize certain sins as sinful. Pedophilia is still on the list, right? Who knows for how long?
For the time being, right?
But there are things that are not necessarily sinful. They're just disagreements about opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like about the Supreme Court ruling. For some people, it was a great moral victory, right? Mm-hmm. That Roe v. Wade got overturned and kind of things got kicked to the states. And for others, that was the worst thing that happened to women and their bodies and their freedoms, right? And so Christians are being taken down for basically single-handedly orchestrating that, right?
Right, yeah.
Through uniting and backing certain presidents and certain Supreme Court justices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the takedowns, sometimes will be kind of no-brainer kind of takedowns, and some are like, well, I don't know. There are different opinions on that, but the media has clearly chosen a side on certain topics, right? And is throwing Christians under the bus. And then, of course, you have Christian publishing companies who want to rush to publish books, right, that enter into that debate, right?
Yeah.
And so there are books that then take people down, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what everyone's talking about. That's what they want to read about, and that's going to sell.
Yep, because they want to make money. They're a publisher. I get it. To stay in business, you got to sell books. You got to make money. And so recognizing the hot topic is often a way for them to make a lot of money, because it helps them stay in business. And I would hate to be in that position where you're trying to make decisions based on what's good for your business, making money, but it's like, God, do we really want to wade into this? Can I stand before God someday and try to justify having done it? That's a really tough conversation to have.
Yeah. So that's the subject.
Yeah.
And so what we've done, like usual, we've come up with lists of verses, and this time we've kind of clumped them into 4 different categories, and by design, we're hoping to get through the first 2 categories today, and maybe the second 2 categories next week.
Yep.
Which for us will be later today.
Exactly.
So the first kind of and so what we're suggesting in these 4 categories these are just factors that we need to weigh. Right. We're not going to be prescriptive. Here is the Christian approach to every single instance. Right. They're going to be a case by case basis of how we might respond. But are there principles that should guide us to get us thinking Christianly about how to engage big picture wise? And then we'll take those big picture principles not we as in us three, but all of us, right?
Yeah.
Collectively will kind of hopefully bring this scriptural resources to bear when specific scandals happen. And so the first subtopic, cluster verses is there are verses that tell us to kind of expect bad press.
Yeah.
Like there's a certain level that Christians, just by being Christians, not even by doing anything stupid, right? Like immoral, professionally immoral, but like just acting out of our Christian convictions with integrity, we're going to get bad press. Society's going to hate us. And so this is a factor that needs to kind of be weighed into the discussion. So we've got a few verses here.
Yep.
Sam, you want to do the first one?
Sure. We're starting Matthew 10, and here Jesus is sending out the disciples and on their kind of a mini missionary journey and a little missions trip. And in the midst of it, he's talking about like things aren't going to always go well for you. And he says, I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. And there's, you're going to suffer because of it. And then in verse 21, he says, brother, brother will betray brother to death, a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved.
Yeah.
And it does go say, when they persecute you in one town, and then it got like, so he's casting a picture of, as Christians, it's going to be pretty bad for you, actually. People are going to hate you, they're going to persecute you, and it's not going to go well for you. And why? Because of his name, right? Because he's sending them out in his name to do things in his name. And so the very nature of being called a Christian, like being affiliated with Christ, puts you in a camp that the world will hate you.
Yeah.
And that's stark.
Yeah, I want to get all three of these first passages out there because that way we can talk about them together.
Yeah.
But then we'll return to that thought.
No problem.
Yeah. I definitely got things to add to that.
I got excited.
The next one is from Matthew 24, beginning in verse 19. Jesus is speaking to his followers, and he says, they will hand you over to be tortured, and you will be put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come.
Okay. And then Luke's got a parallel situation that says similar things but adds his own little twist. Luke chapter 6, 22-23. Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you, revile you, and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets.
Yep.
All right.
Well, and, this is not just something that Jesus came up with. Like, he's got this new thing that's going to be this new experience for all the followers of God. The Old Testament's full of that. Cain killed Abel. His righteous brother was put to death by Cain, who was mad over the whole situation. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. King David had to flee David before he was king, had to flee from Saul. I always think of Jeremiah, being thrown into a cistern and put in stocks and all that kind of stuff. Like, this whole idea of the righteous suffering at the hands of the wicked is just a very biblical, very major part of the biblical story. And when Jesus talks about it, he's like, guys, if you know your Bible, you got to know that this is what's going to happen to you. People are not going to like you and the message that you're bringing. And if you're signing up for a good time, you got to go someplace else, because being my follower is not going to be that for you.
Yeah. And I think what these have in common and why it's important to have them as, rolling around in our head as we think about how to respond when Christians are, getting thrown down in the news is, this is happening in the context of a world that hates us.
Yeah.
That hates the Christian message, that thinks that churches and ministers and congregations and Christian organizations are holding society back from forward progress.
Yeah.
Like, we are the enemies of the common good.
Yep. We're unenlightened, uninformed, backward-thinking people.
And so we're told that's going to happen.
Yep.
And that even people close to us are going to disown us, betray us, right? So knowing that that's the context, I think, is important. We always have to ask the question, are things being framed and spun in a certain way in the news as a kind of extension of the world's hating Christians. Like, oh, here's an opportunity to expose Christianity before the world and frame the Christian gospel as being a bunch of fundamentalists who are anti-societal progress. Like, here's a example of one moral failing of someone who did something that everyone disagrees is wrong, and that's just another reason why you can't trust Christians, or you can't trust churches, or you can't, their rejection, their hating, their hurling of insults, their canceling is taking place as part of this wider narrative of the world hating us.
Yeah. And I think that I've known a lot of Christians who have struggled with that because, of course, people want to be liked. Well, maybe not me so much, but other people, they want to be liked. And yes, there are times when I want to be liked as well. And so when the world dislikes us, it's very tempting to align with the world so that we can experience their goodwill and their acceptance. And so I get that. It takes a lot of courage, a lot of willingness to persevere for Christ's sake to say, I'm not going to go along with that, even though you are painting me in the worst possible light, which I know is not true. It's not an easy thing to do. I'm sympathetic with people who struggle with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got thoughts, but I feel like they're going to bleed into other categories, so I'm trying to be careful not to. But one thing I just think of is just Christians need to understand that the world views us as enemies.
Yeah.
Right? We should not view them as enemies.
Right.
But understand that's how they view us. And, shouldn't be surprised when these things happen. Like, some people are, totally taken aback. Like, I don't get it. And, well, it's because you're their enemy. Like, why would they look for your best or give you the benefit of the doubt? Yeah. They wouldn't. And again, I'm casting a very broad strokes. That's how the Bible frames it, is the world, not every single person you're going to encounter, but I mean the fact that because of what Christ has done in challenging the power of sin in the world, there's going to be conflict. Yeah. And so it's expected.
Well, I think in the Western world too, it's just so surprising to people because Christianity, at least in a very superficial sense, is dominated for so long. And it's been the state religion or the accepted religion. And even people who are not necessarily strong believers still adhere to a code of behavior that looks superficially like Christian. And so here in America, we're just moving into a period where Christianity isn't popular. And more Christians are just like, oh my gosh, what's happening? They're kind of freaking out. And I keep wanting to have these gentle conversations to say, guys, this is just what Jesus said was going to happen. We're actually experiencing something more like what the first century church experienced in our society. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's not the way it's been, but it is where things are moving. And it's not because the world is falling apart. It's because the world is doing what the world does.
Yeah. And this just means that every time there's bad press in the news, like someone has done something wrong, so then it just means that there's layers of complication on top of that.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yes, this Christian person or this Christian priest or, this celebrity has done this terrible thing. And those who are waving their hands saying, hey, look, this terrible thing is happening. Why isn't anyone doing anything about it? Why are people covering it up? That's good.
Right.
That needs to happen. People need to point out when that's happening. And so whenever there's a cancel situation, there are the real witnesses, the real victims, the real atrocities committed by real Christians, right, that are the cause of this. And in that sense, because of our love for justice, right, we want to see, we want that to be exposed. We want whoever's being harmed to be freed from that oppression or whatever, right? But at the same time that legitimate work of exposing wrongs is happening, then there is the machine that's going to say, and here is an opportunity for us to do another hit job on Christianity.
Yeah.
And so then the legitimate criticisms and concerns and rebukes and censures, on top of that is being overlaid the world that hates us and is going to use this as an opportunity to try to take down Christianity yet another notch in the eyes of a bunch of people who are on the fence. right? But the people who are strong in their faith, the takedown of Christians on the other side of the world is not going to really bug them, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, Christians do stupid things. They always did. Just read the New Testament, read the Old Testament. Like, God's people always do wrong and they get rebuked, even like David and Peter and Judas,
Yeah.
So it's not really a surprise to us. And the people who hate Christianity, it's just going to, confirm everything they hate about Christianity. But it's the fence sitters that's where the opportunity is.
Yeah.
Those who are having doubts or maybe thinking about entering into Christianity, but like this might keep them from doing that, or maybe thinking of leaving Christianity and this might push them toward doing that.
Right.
Like the world, the forces that are aligned against the church that hate us and want to see our cause fail are going to see this as an opportunity, which just makes it a tricky time for us.
It does. I agree.
And we just need to have that in our mind. There's the truth tellers who are exposing the falsehood that needs to be, and then there is the world that hates us, that's trying to take us down collectively.
Yeah.
And our response to one or the other should be different, I would think.
Yeah, well, that's just it. As we said earlier in the episode, that Jesus is giving us a different way to respond. If we're just going along with the world, that right there should give us pause and go, wait. Is this really a Christ-like response? And cause us to step back and examine what Jesus has taught us and say, all right, how do I portray a different witness to the world? Even the way we respond to Christians who've done horrible things. I'm not trying to justify anybody's bad decisions.
Right.
If they've done horrible things, does Jesus give a response to that allows us to stand out from the world and show a different way forward?
All right. So they hate us, but there's more.
But wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more.
I mean, turn over to 1 Peter. We're going to be in 1 Peter a lot, actually, because it's kind of what the book's about.
It is about
is
suffering.
living in these sorts of times.
Yeah.
And in chapter 2 of 1 Peter, starting verse 11, he says this, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles." Aliens would be a great mascot for a Christian college.
Gee, you think, Sam?
I do. That's aside. I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is just goes back to what we were just talking about, that we should stand out. We should be different in our response. If you're looking around, you're hearing what the world is saying, and you're saying the same thing, you just got to step back and go, all right, what did Jesus call me to so that I can look different, so I can reflect a different set of values that have their origin in God himself? And so abstain from the desires of the flesh. Don't just follow the flesh, but behave in a way that is honorably, or it is honorable, I should say, so that the Gentiles can see that. And some are not going to like it. They're just going to call us names. But, it's a narrow gate. It's a narrow door. There's not going to be that many. But what about that one person who goes, man, Sam did something different today. His response was so different, and I want to know more about it. That's an opportunity for us to say, yeah, it's because God doesn't condone that person's behavior, but said, here's how you should respond.
This passage, I think, juxtaposed next to the ones we just read, is frustrating. Because on the one hand, it says they hate you. Yeah. But here it says, but you know what? They're going to glorify your God in heaven. I'm sorry. How does that work? Right? And there's just this frustrating tension that takes place.
Yeah.
But the key for me has to be the whole conduct yourselves so that they may malign you as evildoers, but you're actually doing honorable deeds. And that's the problem. We have a bunch of Christians who do terrible things.
Yeah.
And they're indefensible.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's like he's identifying a whole different thing. You know what should make the news is Christians getting arrested for feeding homeless people because that's illegal. That's what should make the news.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. Like, they're going to malign you. Like, no, that's against the law. But that's a really good thing. Maybe we should not make feeding homeless people legal, which, by the way, it is in some places.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen news stories about Christians doing that
right.
very thing.
Like, that's what should be filling our news feeds, not these other awful things, is I think what Peter's saying here. And yet, that's not what happens. And so, we have these two things that are constantly in tension about they're going to hate you. And how do you overcome that hate? Well, you do it by living just an honorable life, like not being a hypocrite. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem. We are.
Yeah, and so this kind of paints a picture of, and this really is a theme of the book of 1 Peter, mm-hmm. and it's really kicking off the next several chapters. But it's presuming the framework Jesus talked about. Right? The Gentile mission has begun. They're scattered. This is written to aliens and exiles scattered throughout the world as Christians in these Christian communities. And people are going to be maligning Christians.
Yeah.
And this book's going to make clear they're going to be maligning them for doing stupid things, and they're going to be reminding them for doing godly things. And for them, they're equal opportunity maligners, right? And the response, what's not in this response is not like, so make sure you join in on the maligning when they're doing stupid things, maligning fellow Christians when they're being bad, and then get behind them and defend them when they're being good, right? Like, that's not the advice. The advice is what you talked about, Sam's like, live such honorable lives so that even though they're going to malign for both the good and the bad, if you just remain steadfast in living godly lives, they might come to glorify God when he comes to judge. Like, the consistency of your character and your service will eventually soften hearts, and some people will come to know Christ that way.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's the same mindset that he has a little bit later in the letter in 1 Peter 4, beginning verse 3. He's writing to Gentiles. I think he's writing to primarily a Gentile audience. And he says, you've already spent enough time in doing what the Gentiles like to do, living in licentiousness, passions, drunkenness, revels, carousing, and lawless idolatry. They are surprised that you no longer join them in the same excess of dissipation, and they blaspheme. I love that, dissipation. That's a word we just don't get to use very often. Ever. But they will have to give an accounting to him who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead, so that though they had been judged in the flesh as everyone is judged, they might live in the spirit as God does. And so the world is going to be surprised because we're not doing what they do. We're not joining in with them. And so they're going to be surprised by that. They're going to mock us for that. And I think that's one thing that a lot of Christians just don't understand, is that the kind of persecution that's often talked about in the Bible is not being killed or thrown in jail or beaten up, although that certainly does happen. Yeah. But it's the mockery. It's making fun of us. It's when Christians show up in people's comedic monologues or whatever, and people don't like being made fun of. It's like, oh, I don't like that. Maybe I need to dial things back. Instead of saying, this is just the way it's going to be. They are going to laugh at you and make fun of you because you're not enlightened. You're not progressive enough. You're not up with where society is. Guys, you got to be willing to own that if you want to be a follower of Jesus.
Yeah, I like to hear how Paul just recognizes, not Paul, Peter, that Christians are not people who have always been perfect and just lived great lives. Like, we used to live lives that were very much like the pagans. We used to share their values. We used to share their practices and participate in those practices. Yeah. And when we pull apart, when they go one step too far for us, or when it's not that they've stepped too far, we've stepped out of that whole web of practices.
Yeah. It's not that we stepped back. We've just stepped out of the circle altogether.
Yeah. Then they're going to say, hey, where'd you go? Yeah. And you're going to be like, yeah, I don't want to live that life anymore. And that's, even if you say that gently, it kind of is received as condemnation.
For sure.
Oh, yeah.
And you shouldn't live that life anymore, too.
Yeah, what? It's not good enough for anymore? Like, no, it's actually not.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that is going to invite scorn. Like, it's going to invite, and here are people who are, they're not doing, it's not, all you're doing is withdrawing from the life you used to live.
Yeah.
And that's going to bring on the wrath of others. And so this is where society is a little different. I think, there are specific instances where Christians are kind of canceled on account of doing something like this. But like you talked about before, Ron, like, Christians used to be like the moral majority of the country, so to speak, right? And, we're viewed as Goliaths, not the Davids anymore, but we're the Goliaths that the less powerful people have been trying to take down for a long time. Yeah. And they're finally watching us fall. Yeah. Right. And so for them, it's like, we are the oppressors, the ones with power, the ones that we're using this to, and what's going to happen is, you can talk about specific instances where Christians use their power to do bad things, like some of these scandals, what people did with power and privilege and money and connections, right? And meanwhile, what they were doing on the side was totally immoral. But because we have that Goliath kind of smear on us, even when we're doing, we're living by our moral convictions. This is an area where we just don't live the way the world that we don't have the same sexual ethic as the world.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not going to be looked at as we used to live that way and now we don't. It's going to be looked at as, you are the power bearers who have made it so that all of us had to live by your moral standards for a long time now, and we won't take it anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like Twisted Sister. We're not going to take it.
Yeah. It's a different frame.
Yeah.
Altogether.
Yeah.
And that's a distance between us and maybe the audience of First Peter, right? Where we used to be doing that with them, and now we're withdrawing, and they're like, "Hey, where'd you go? I don't like this." But it's kind of like we used to be leading them in this moral conviction or this moral way of life or this way of framing things.
Yeah.
And now that we don't have that power, right, we're not providing that leadership anymore, and we're getting, because the world hates us, they're framing that disengagement in the worst possible way.
Right.
Yeah. It does make kind of an argument, this is a little bit of a side note, but an argument for embracing a literal powerlessness of meekness and humility. And like, I can't force anybody to do anything, and I don't want to. I have no power, because then we are powerless people who are simply trying to lead by the story of our own lives. But yeah, for the longest time, it was power that was enforced by the law and by judges and people with guns and stuff like that. And yeah, people are pushing back hard against it and doing it in the worst possible way, but I think it's a good description of what's been happening.
Yeah. Well, we have time to move into our third category. I'm looking at the time. We have about 3 minutes
Yeah,
left.
it's about 3 minutes left.
Or do you want a fresh start with the next episode?
I have a feeling we're not going to be able to do it in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, looking at the clock, this is the thing is, people don't realize it. We're looking at the clock and going, how much time do we have here, and what can we really, really do? So I suppose we could either kibitz.
Let's call it here.
I was going to say we can kibitz, or we can just call it a little bit short.
Short.
Short it is.
All right.
Well, thank you for joining us in this 3 minutes shorter episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The best conversations happen.
After class.
We'll send you a refund.